road, crit and sometimes track racer with a good interest in sports science and a limited degree of natural talent. I spent a fair amount of time reading sports science information and training manuals. However, it's only recently that I've realised quite how much of the information is based on data from studies looking only at men. In fact, one review found that only 3% of sports science studies looked exclusively at women, and the March 2016 Journal of Sports Science used only 12% female participants. That gender data gap gets pretty serious when we start looking at medicine. But does it rear its head in cycling? Yes, it does. I spoke to Neil Henderson and Matt Cassin. They've worked with some seriously elite athletes, for example, helping to power Rowan Dennis and Evelyn Stevens to our record success. However, they also help the likes of you and me, designing cutting-edge training programs and sessions with the Sufferfest. They're based in Boulder, Colorado, at the Sufferfest High Performance Division. I gave them a call to see if they could tell me if women should train differently, and if so, how.
Overall, there are a couple things that we see as just a general difference between men and women. Men, on average, are bigger. Size-wise, they weigh more, they have more muscle mass, especially upper body muscle mass. They have a little bit more fast-twitch muscle fiber, typically, in that their oxygen delivery, and especially VO2 max, tends to be a little bit higher. And we also see a difference in the amount of circulating testosterone levels are significantly higher in men versus women. We also have differences in the monthly hormonal fluctuations, that women have a much greater fluctuation in several of the hormones that men do not have. So if you're looking at different hormonal fluctuations and responses to exercise or training and things like that, that you'd have to match the phase first when you're doing your testing within the women's monthly cycle. And so that's going to extend the time typically required to do that, and just add an element that a lot of undergraduate studies, I would say, they just don't have the resources, they don't have a longer time period to be able to get that study done in a given semester. And so there has, unfortunately, because of those additional challenges to work around, have not been included at the same rate as men have been in a lot of these studies.
Yeah, so testosterone is, one of the most potent hormones out there. When, a lot of people know or have heard of anabolic steroids and people who dope with anabolic steroids, and really all those are either synthetic versions of testosterone or chemicals that increase your body's own production of testosterone. So when you look at it in that sense, that men just naturally have higher testosterone levels, you can kind of view that as that's going to be a difference in performance of not just absolute strength, but also the ability to recover. Testosterone, is great for building lean muscle mass, but it will also help you recover from a hard session. So you can, in essence, do harder sessions more frequently and get higher strength gains.
And one of the strengths that Sufferfest has is having a huge amount of data from athletes that have done the 4DP test, which looks at 5 second, 5 minute, 20 minute, and then 1 minute power at fatigue. So what have you kind of garnered any gender differences from that data, and what can we do with that?
We have a pretty big data set, both men and women, and we express everything in one simple way of just dividing by FTP. So if we look at your peak neuromuscular power, 5 second sprint power relative to FTP, that's where we see the biggest difference on average between men and women. That it is a pretty profound lower percentage for women than men relative to their FTP. As we go to the next intensity level, the anaerobic capacity, that difference is a lot smaller. And the difference then of max aerobic power, 5 minute power versus that FTP is almost the same. There's almost no difference on average of the percentage that women are achieving 5 minute power relative to their 20 minute power. But it is really going back, that 5 second difference being the single greatest one that we see.
And if I'm a racing woman, I'm racing other women, and we've all got that slightly different physiology. How much does it matter? Do I need to train any differently as a result?
Yeah, so when you look at it in that way, that's really just an even a better opportunity to develop, a strength or a skill set that some of your competitors might not have. Yes, it might be that on average for a given race that takes place, the pro men's field and then the pro women's field, that yes, the men will have a higher sprint power proportional to FTP, but that doesn't mean that it's a non-factor in a women's race. You look at just about every super exciting finish that we've seen in women's racing over the past couple of years, and it's often someone doing a sprint and pipping someone at the line, and that's all a factor of being able to produce that really high top end neuromuscular and anaerobic effort.
Absolutely. So how do I go about doing that? It's $1 million question.
Yeah, so there's a certain component of strength and just straight up how much force you can put into the pedals. That's going to be very important here. So strength training actually has considerable value for developing that peak power. So within the Sufferfest app, we have more bodyweight based strength training, which is a really good step into then being able to do heavier weights. And as we know that there's these differences in testosterone levels between men and women, doing heavy resistance training in women is going to create far less change in muscle size. But there can still be considerable increases in muscle strength. And that really comes to the neuromuscular activation of what you've got, getting those better neural pathways from brain to muscle to connect and to be able to produce force.
And I guess, there must be training on the bike that we should be doing as well.
Yeah, so something like standing starts, which is an effort you see a lot on the track, that's something you can very easily do out on the road. And that's just getting into a nice big gear, big chainring, probably like third largest cog, rolling to stopping if you're skilled enough to hold off a track stand.
Which is a great way to work on your track stand.
And then just doing a maximal effort to get up to speed as quickly as possible. Then you get that full activation, and to get the pedals around, you need to recruit all the muscles in your legs, and it's applicable directly to cycling because you're going through the exact same range of motion that you are when you're out of the saddle.
Yeah, and with that, the efforts are typically about 15 to 20 seconds long, and you're also working on being able to connect the upper body strength and power through your core and deliver that power into the pedals. So again, we do see on average a little bit of a difference in upper body muscular strength between men and women, and working though on that coordination of that standing start type of power delivery into the pedal again is going to be advantage.
Okay, and if I go about doing the strength sessions and the kind of standing starts that we've talked about, and I'm benchmarking myself correctly so I know what I'm aiming for in those sprints, should women be doing anything differently in terms of recovery than maybe men might?
So the thing that you would want to consider is it may take a little bit longer time to recover from those really high intensity strength sessions and neuromuscular and peak neuromuscular power sessions. So just giving yourself a couple, 2 or 3 days of recovery between those sessions is probably going to be the thing that's most different and more important.
Mm-hmm. And this is true against anyone doing that sort of training, but recovery immediately after is really helped by nutrition. And so if you do a hard strength session or sprint session, don't be afraid to consume some protein and some good high quality carbohydrates.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we know with women that actually the branched chain amino acids and especially leucine intake after training sessions actually is quite helpful for helping that recovery. So paying attention to what is in what you take in for recovery and make sure that there's some branched chain amino acids in there, and especially a higher content of leucine will be definitely helpful to enhance your recovery rate relative to not doing that.
That's really good to know. And those of us who are tracking our training via apps, like Training Peaks is a good example, but you can also do so via Strava. We're often looking at training stress score and sort of tracking training with a score for each session. Is there any gender difference there that we need to bear in mind?
Yeah, so I think it's helpful to think about this. If you just get two theoretical riders, a male and a female, maybe they both have the same FTP of 180 watts or 200 watts or whatever. If they were to both go out and do maximal 30-second repeated efforts, so that's a bit anaerobic capacity, neuromuscular sort of workout. On average, based on what we know from data we've collected from all the tests that people have done in the Sufferfest is we know that for the same FTP, men will be able to produce more power for shorter durations as a percentage of that FTP. When you know that normalized power and intensity factor is really weighing the efforts you're doing against your FTP, then that means if one of you is doing a maximal effort at 600 watts and the other one's doing a maximal effort at 400 watts, even though those are both maximal, in one of them, the 600 watts, that's 3 times your FTP, so that will be weighted very heavily, versus the other one is only twice your FTP, so that will be weighted less. So you get those situations where with the same FTP doing the same relative efforts compared to your own ability, you get a situation where the person who produces less power over shorter durations isn't going to get as high of a training stress score. Their normalized power won't be as high, so their intensity factor won't be as high. So in essence, those equations, TSS will say that they didn't work as hard as the other individual. That becomes, an extra issue when you know that, because of the difference in testosterone and some other factors, women are going to recover a bit slower. So not only did you both do the same maximal session, but on average, the female rider will take a bit longer to recover from that. But when you look at that TSS and then your CTL and all that stuff, the male rider will have gotten a higher acute training load, and then, but will actually be able to do more the next day. Whereas the female rider will have a lower acute training load, but actually won't be able to do as much the next day. And so that's something where in those charts, when they look at chronic training load, acute training load, those are generally done on a chronic training load is looking at the past 42 days, acute training load is looking at the past 7 days. That's something that you can edit and change what parameters, how many days you're looking at. And that might be something that for women and even masters athletes, shortening that acute training load measurement. So instead of looking at a 7-day rolling average of those sessions, looking at a 5-day rolling average, so you can really get a better sense of when you have an accumulation of really hard sessions back to back. That can be a way to still get the intended benefit and usefulness out of those charts, but without just assuming that everyone's the same and responds the same and recovers the same and is graded the same on every session that they do.
I found my time with Neil and Mac really interesting and really insightful, and I felt pretty lucky to be able to speak to people with so much experience. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please hit like and subscribe, and let us know what you think in the comments.